Welcome to my podcast. Today I'll be talking about fantasy hockey and fantasy football waiver wire advice, and also be talking about draft advice in fantasy basketball. Fantasy hockey waiver wire, players to pick up number 3. Center C-Tomas Hertl. C-Tomas Hertl had 2 goals, 4 points, and 2 power play points to go along with 55 faceoff wins last week. He plays on the second line and second power play unit of the San Jose Sharks. Left winger C-Tomas Tatar. C-Tomas Tatar put up 3 goals, 5 points, and 1 power play point last week. He plays on the second line and first power play unit of the Red Wings. Right winger Dorsett. Dorsett recorded 4 goals, 42 penalty minutes, and 14 hits last week. Don't expect him to keep scoring like he is, but he will be useful if you need penalty minutes and hits. Defenseman D-Mikael Sergachev and Montour. D-Mikael Sergachev put up 3 goals, 6 points, and 2 power play points last week. He should be owned in all leagues. Montour will get the opportunity to play on the first power play unit of the Ducks with the injuries on the Ducks blue line. Goaltender Reimer. Reimer will get the chance to be the number 1 goalie for the Florida Panthers with Roberto Luongo injured. Next week, I'll be doing another fantasy hockey waiver wire. Fantasy football waiver wire, players to pick up for week 8. Quarterback Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod Taylor put up 20.02 fantasy points in week 7 and has a favorable matchup in week 8 against the Oakland Raiders. Running back Marlon Mack. Marlon Mack was one of the bright spots for the Colts in week 7. He could be a valuable asset in deep leagues. Running back D-Dion Lewis. D-Dion Lewis is not going to be putting up monster numbers each week, but you can expect a solid 6 to 8 fantasy points a week. Wide receiver Kenny Stills. Kenny Stills had a monster week 7 with 85 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. He looks to have established a good connection with quarterback Matt Moore. Wide receiver Paul Richardson. Paul Richardson had 12.10 fantasy points in week 7. He looks to continue his strong play in week 8 against the Houston Texans. Tight end O.J. Howard. O.J. Howard had his breakout game in week 7 with 98 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Pick him up in dynasty leagues. Defense, Chicago Bears defense. The Chicago Bears defense have put up double-digit fantasy points in back-to-back weeks. They look to keep up their hot play against the New Orleans Saints in week 8. Kicker Kai Forbath. Kai Forbath is the most added kicker in fantasy football. Next week, I'll be talking about players to pick up in fantasy football for week 9. Draft advice in fantasy basketball. Drafting in fantasy basketball is quite easy if you know what you're doing. The first player you pick in the draft is the most important. That is your star player. You need to make sure that this player is going to produce on a nightly basis. Good centers tend to go quickly, so if you want to get a good center, draft them early. Draft players that have a well-rounded stat line. Get a good mix of scoring, rebounding, assists, blocks, and 3-pointers made. Players that shoot a high field goal percentage. If you have a player that shoots a low free throw percentage, make sure you get a good free throw shooter to compensate. Before your actual draft, do a mock draft and identify the sleeper players you may want to draft. Drafting a well-balanced team is very important. You need to get production from all your players. The key to drafting a good fantasy basketball team is being well prepared and knowing potential breakout players. Next week, I'll be talking about sleepers in fantasy basketball. Next podcast, I'll be talking about fantasy hockey and fantasy football waiver wire advice, and also be talking about sleepers in fantasy basketball.